this sweltering day. It's funny, I thought of this area as a sort of Dickensian slum. I think that's the way it was when I was last here, about 50 years ago. Welcome to Rough Trade East. My name is Thomas Dolby, and I'm an author, I suppose, these days. One of the many chapters of my sort of rather unusual life. I have to say it's far more intimidating actually appearing in front of 20 people than 20,000. But the format tonight is going to be, well, I'm here to talk about my new book, and I'm going to tell you a bit about the book and how I came to write it, and then I'll open it up, and if you guys want to get interactive and ask me that burning question you've always had, been dying to ask me, then tonight is the night. And the nice thing about only having 20 people here is that if I screw up, there's very few witnesses that I have to sort of bump off down the road. I was first approached to write a book about 2.5 years ago, and a publisher came to me and sort of said, we're looking for somebody to write a sort of tech guru business book, with the music business slant, and would you be interested? And that sounded like exactly the kind of book that I would not like to read, let alone write. But it did prompt me to start digging through my old drawers, and I found that in the early days of my career I used to keep notes all the time. I used to fill out a diary almost every night, and it fell off a little bit sort of in the middle of the 80s. And then it came back again in the 90s when I was more in the sort of tech world, and I was keeping meeting notes. So in a bottom drawer of my house in East Anglia, there were old filofaxes, old notebooks, old Palm Pilots and Apple Newtons, and all sorts of yellow pads containing sort of meeting notes and things that I've kept, and they were rather amazing to read because, for example, there was one from about 1992, which just said something like, "Had dinner with Bill Gates last night. He had a tantrum in the middle and started screaming his head off. But tomorrow is the Information Superhighway Conference. Can't wait to get home to California." That was a sort of typical diary entry. And what was sort of charming about it was that, if the music tech business guru had written this in a book in 2017, it would have been slews of sort of didactic lecturing about the failure of the analog music business and how, the record industry just didn't fail to see what was coming and what was around the corner, and so the burgeoning tech industry took up the mantle and sort of created the web and the internet and all the rest of it. That's the way it would have looked if it had been the Tech Guru book. But I actually thought this diary entry was far more interesting reading than that kind of a book. And so I thought, well, maybe what I could do is actually splice together all of those old diary entries that I had and fill in some of the blanks in the same kind of character voice as the rest of it. And so I started out writing a book that actually began, each entry began with, February 17th, 1992, and what happened on that date. And so I started making a timeline of all of these diary entries, figuring out where I would have to fill in the blanks. And I thought, well, if I need a date between February 92 and, November 92, I'll just pick August the 3rd, and then somebody could go and research and fact check it later and see if the dates actually lined up. Well, this format of a book was enough of an interesting idea to get me a literary agent, which was great, and it was enough of an interesting idea to get me a few meetings with publishers in New York, one of whom offered me a contract. And it got me as far as about the second or third meeting with the publisher after I signed the contract, when inevitably the other boot fell and somebody said, "We love what we've read so far, Thomas. Just wondering when you're going to get rid of the journal format and actually start writing it in a continuous, first person, past tense narrative." And I was very upset by this because I thought, well, that's going to actually blow the sort of spontaneity of those meeting notes, and it's going to end up being that music tech guru book. And I have not very much experience as a writer, so I was really worried that I wouldn't have the chops, to maintain the spontaneity in a narrative format. But they said, well, just go with it, and we'll hire an editor for you. And if the editor thinks that you need to change tacks or change styles, I'm sure he or she will let you know. So I started writing the book, and they gave me a deadline. They gave me a word count, which I think was 90,000 words, and I had a deadline that was about 2.5 months hence. And I divided the number of days that I had by the number of words I had to deliver, and it came out to 1,600 words a day. So over the course of those 2.5 months, every morning I got up and I went into my lifeboat studio and I started writing, and I could see the word count at the bottom, and I couldn't leave that room until there were 1,600 words done. So after a couple of weeks of this, I was actually doing rather well. I was actually up to quota, and I realised that I was going to hit that 90,000 mark before the deadline. But I realised to my horror that that would only get me about a third of the way through the book. So I had to sort of scale it back a little bit and put on a different lens. And the net result at the end of the day was that I got sort of very close to the end of the book, and I was dying to hand it in and see what the editor that they'd hired was going to make of it and the feedback that he was going to give me. And I thought that he's going to come back with these reams of notes about things that I could add or take away or change. And that would be very helpful to me as a beginning writer. So I sent in the manuscript, and about a week later I got an email and reply, and a sort of bated breath I opened it, and he said, "This is great." And I'm going, that was it, yeah, that was it. And I mean, anything else? And there was one or two, I think there were about 2 paragraphs in the entire manual where he just highlighted it, and alongside it said, "Delete?" ? And so I sort of went through his Word document, and I just would highlight that paragraph and hit delete. And even deleting those 2 paragraphs was like, really hurt. But anyway, so I just followed his notes, which were very minimal, sent it back, and he said, great, we've got a release date. I said, well, that was kind of quick. I was a bit nervous about it. I thought, well, there are far more famous musicians than me. Oh, this is the other thing, is that they took my title, The Speed of Sound, and they added memoir at the bottom. And I thought, a memoir, I hadn't really thought of it as a memoir up to that point. And I thought, well, there must be much more famous musicians that are more entitled than I am to write a memoir at this point in their lives. And I said, well, okay, so they're going to put it out in the 4th quarter of 2016. And I said, so any other musician autobiographies coming out during that quarter? And they said, well, we got Brian Wilson, Phil Collins, Robbie Robertson, and Bruce Springsteen. Okay, no contest. So it came out last year in the States in a rather crowded sort of musician bio marketplace. And to my delight, the feedback that I got was, this is actually rather different for a musician memoir. And the difference, I think, were, number one, I actually wrote it, which is a nice thing. But number two, a lot of people knew about me from one aspect of my career, but not from the other. So a lot of people thought of me as, the guy that did Hyperactive, She Blinded Me with Science, whatever. And then they lost track of me around about 1990. But then actually, in the States, and especially with a slightly younger sort of West Coast geeky generation, it was quite the opposite. They came on, their earliest memories were after the era when MTV was actually playing music, but in the era when the web was it. And so their first encounter with me was, an interview in Wired magazine where I was talking about the future of music on the internet. So there are different sort of sectors of the species that were aware of me in different ways, but actually very few that sort of knew the whole spectrum of things that I'd done during my career. So I was very pleased with the feedback. But what a lot of people said, and this is a big fear of mine about the book, and in fact, in the preface of the book, I dedicate it to my kids, my 3 children, who asked me one day, you know, Daddy, how come you're not a multi-millionaire? And I sort of thought, well, that's actually rather a suitable topic for the book. How come I'm not actually a multi-millionaire? And I was slightly worried that, you know, people would want the Hollywood ending. You know, they want it to end up that I'd picked out my private island in the Caribbean and sort of lived happily ever after on the billions that I made for what I did. And I was slightly worried that people would get to the end of the book and go, oh, you know, like it didn't turn out that way. But actually, quite the contrary. The feedback that I got was people were sort of delighted that it wasn't a book about how I made my first billion. It was actually a book that sort of was willing to own up to the mistakes that I made and you know, the insecurity that I felt about the whole thing. That was what they liked about it, and that's what sort of really set it apart from other books of its type that I'd written, that had been written. So many of the stories in the book and the anecdotes are ones that I've sort of told verbally over the years, but the challenge really was to write them down and have them make sense written down. So I thought what I might do tonight is actually read you a couple of the things from the book, and then if you want to ask me about what really happened, everything in the book is sort of as truthful as I can make it, but invariably it comes out differently when you're just having a sort of one-on-one conversation with somebody than when you're writing and you're trying to convey this to, you know, an unknown mass market, hopefully mass market audience. So I'm going to take a couple of things from the book, and the first of them came about, it's slightly sort of out of time, because rather than start when my music career started at the end of the 70s, this first episode in the book is actually a little way into the 80s, when I'd already kind of made a splash in the USA, and I was touring in the States, and I did a concert in Los Angeles at the Greek Theatre, which is, you know, gorgeous open-air theatre, and they had a sort of tent set up backstage for a green room, and I came off stage with my band and we'd had a good gig, and somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, Michael Jackson's here. And I said, oh, I'd met Michael before, briefly, because we were editing videos at the same time in Soho. I was doing She Blinded Me With Science, and he was actually next door doing Billie Jean, of all things, and we got sort of chatty, and I'd spent an evening with him at his house in Encino, which was astonishing. But this was a couple of years after that he'd shown up and announced really to one of my shows, and so there I was in this tent behind the stage at the Greek Theatre, and somebody said, Michael's here, and I said, oh, please bring him back. And they said, well, he's got about 32 people with him, and that was obviously much larger than my band and crew put together. I said, well, bring him in. And so everybody started sort of packing themselves in like sardines to this tent that was designed for about 20. And the crowd sort of parted, and Michael made his way through, and he sort of led me off to the side of the tent. So we were about this far away from the canvas, and he just started talking to me very quietly. And he was mainly interested in the fact that I had a Fairlight on stage, and he'd never seen anybody with a computer music instrument on stage before. It was very risky in those days. And he just bought a synclavier, and the relative prices of the Fairlight and synclavier in those days would have been probably about $90,000 for the Fairlight and about $150,000 for the synclav. So he was wondering, how I rated it versus the synclavier. But he also let slip that he'd come from the Village Recorder, where he was busy on an album called Victory, which he was recording with his brothers. So it was a Jackson's album, and this is really his first sort of release after Thriller. So Thriller had come out, it had broken all records, had been on the charts for months on end, and Michael announces he's going to do this album with his brothers. And they were in the studio, and Michael said to me, it's actually a bit chaotic. And I said, why is it chaotic? And he said, well, each of my brothers wants to get songs on the album. A single song on an album like that would be worth a fortune. And they've come in with these rather lame demos, and so we're actually short of songs. So I'm going back there after this, but I'm sort of rather dreading it because we can't agree on what songs to record. He said, have you got anything? I said, absolutely, I've got some brilliant songs knocking around. He said, have you got anything like Hyperactive? I said, yes, as it so happens, I've got one exactly like Hyperactive. same groove, same feel to it. He said, can I hear it? And I said, well, I'd have to make a demo of it, you know, I've programmed it. And he said, well, when can you get me a demo? And I said, well, probably tomorrow. Now, I was on tour at the time, and I was touring around the States in a tour bus. And I had some kit in the back that I could make demos with. And so what I decided to do was to stay up all night after the Greek show and make some demos for Michael. And so I'm going to actually sort of pick up from the book at this point. And at this point, the tour bus was somewhere between Los Angeles and Salt Lake City, Utah, in the Nevada desert. And this is how it goes. In the twilight of the rear lounge, I was rocking out by myself, my face all lit up by LEDs. I had my battery-powered Roland TR-606 drum machine and TB-303 bass line fired up through some Akai headphones. I was punching in melodies on the miniature keys and jotting down random lyric ideas on a yellow pad. My #1 white linen suit and shirt, still damp with sweat from my onstage gyrations at the Greek, were hung up to dry next to me on a mirror. I was wriggling around on the bench seat as I fiddled with my shiny silver boxes, my sopping stage clothes dripping onto the Naugahyde. Dan, that's the Texan bus driver, stuck his head through the curtain and scowled. "Gayest damn bus I ever drove," he muttered. The sun came up somewhere around Barstow. The band had passed out in their coffin-like bunk beds. I was nearing completion of my 2 demos and getting ready to put down a rough vocal. I was pleased with the first, called Interference. It had an irresistible, elastic groove. Okay, so it was a touch reminiscent of Wanna Be Starting Something from the Off the Wall album, but only a touch. He was bound to go for it. I felt he might like the second even better, though it was more restrained, more like a Prince power ballad. But I knew I'd better not mention that. Michael didn't approve of the purple one. "Prince is too dirty," he had told me once. "He can't sing songs about sleeping with your sister." So there I was in the middle of the Nevada desert, head stuffed into a phone booth in the rising heat, trying to hook up my acoustic couplers. I'd called ahead to Michael's sound engineer, Bill Bottrell, who had another Radio Shack TRS-80 at the record plant, ready to receive the digital files. But I'd tried 3 times and I was not getting a dial tone. My stash of quarters wouldn't last forever. I called Bill Bottrell back and he said, "Michael just walked in, I'm going to put him on." Michael came on the phone and I apologised for my tech problems and told him where I was. "Oh," he said, "why don't you just sing it down the phone like in the old days?" Crap. How did I land myself in this one? I took a deep breath, stared out across the desert and started tapping out a beat, one-handed on the metal chassis of the phone box. I cleared my throat and began to sing in the time-honoured fashion of he who has not yet written the lyrics. Interference on my TV, freak dum-dum upside of me. Interference, dum-dum, you are such a loser, you blew your cool. "What does it mean?" interjected Michael. I tried to stamp out a trail of fire ants getting ready to crawl up the leg of my brown corduroy trousers. "What does it mean?" "Yeah, you know, is it like running interference for a quarterback? Or is it television interference, the little dots on your TV screen?" Yes, more like that," I said, a little breathless. "Like digital snow, no signal, garbled radio waves and static, electrostatic wavelengths." Silence on the other end. Eventually Michael said, "What's the other song called?" It's a kind of power ballad," I said. "It's only a groove, really. I'm calling it Iron Curtain." "What's an Iron Curtain?" Michael said. It sounded odd in his high falsetto. "It's a quote from Winston Churchill," I said. I cut my hand over my mouth and put on my best radio imitation. "An iron curtain has descended over Europe." More silence. A tumbleweed rolled by. "Look," I said, "it'll be easier for me to send you the actual demos when I get to my hotel tonight." "Hello? Hello, Michael? Hello? God damn it." I slammed down the receiver. You could hear the wind whistling in the telegraph poles. 30 yards down the road, Dan the driver gave a honk on his horn, and the pneumatic door swung open. I turned and stumbled back towards the bus, juggling wires and cables. Electrostatic wavelengths. What a fucking idiot. I just blew my one shot at writing songs with the new king of pop, and now I wanted to be many thousands of miles away from this infernal desert heat. I wanted my old life back. I wanted to be back in my bedsitter in drab South London in 1978, in the winter of discontent. So, many of the stories in the book, like that, were ones that it was quite hard to sort of capture in a narrative. But as I wrote them down, I sort of strung them all together. Again, I thought back to all, you know, why should I be writing a memoir, other than dropping names like Michael Jackson and David Bowie and stuff like that. And I realised that it sort of comes back to the fact that I was never very comfortable being a sort of celebrity in the first place, right? I mean, I'm naturally quite an introverted person. I'm really a bit of a hermit, actually. And I have this very slender exhibitionist streak that comes out every now and then. But when I started out making music, you know, closer to 1978, in the winter of discontent, I thought I was making fairly marginal sort of underground electronic music. At the time, punk rock was grabbing the headlines. There were still global megastars like Rod Stewart and David Bowie and Mick Jagger and so on. And the electronic music scene in the UK was very underground. You know, it was sort of basically a bunch of smoky basements and guys in anoraks with skin problems, sort of listening to Throbbing Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire and people like that. And I loved that stuff, right? I mean, the first time I ever went to one of those gigs, it was Cabaret Voltaire were on stage, and they had these 8mm projections behind them of bombed out buildings in East Berlin and vivisection experiments and stuff like that. And the front man had a little dictaphone, like an Olympic, you know, mini cassette player, and he was playing sort of samples of Hungarian radio broadcasts as a lead vocal. And I thought, you know, I found my people, this is great. And so I started making music in that context. And it was really a bit of a big surprise to me when I found that there was, you know, that it was going mainstream. And so when I suddenly found that I was able to tour big venues, that my songs were getting played on the radio, that I was getting these amazing invitations from the, you know, Michael Jacksons and David Bowies of the world to collaborate, it felt very alien to me, and the sort of attention that I was getting was not always very comfortable. I always felt I'd been someone that was sort of ignored for most of my life, and now suddenly I was the centre of attention and people were making a big fuss of me, and it was really, it wasn't me, it was like something other than me that they'd sort of, that they had elevated to this level. And so I created this persona for myself, really, the sort of mad scientist persona, and it was a kind of a mask in retrospect, because I wore my little round glasses, and I was able to sort of hide behind that mask of the MTV star. And in a way, if you don't sort of really put your true self on the line, it's a form of protection, so that if the slings and arrows, you know, come for you, it's not really you that they're criticizing, you know, so you don't take it personally. It's just, if they didn't buy into my song, into my persona that I put out there, then that's sort of their problem. It just didn't click. And I think it was really for many years that I resisted the feeling that what I really needed to do in my songs was sort of sing from the heart. I mean, write the truth and be willing to drop my guard and put it out there. And I think as you listen to the progression of my albums over the years, you'll hear that it's more sort of from the inside out as time went on. And I think it's no coincidence that if you tracked the commercial performance, you know, with the red line, and the singing from the heart with the blue line, they would sort of go in opposite directions. But that's actually okay. and that sort of brings me back around to, you know, writing this book at a point in my life where I'm actually very comfortable with who I am and what I've done. I wouldn't really swap places with somebody that had, you know, had strings and strings of platinum albums and things like that. So really what this book is about the choices that you make as an artist. You can go left, you can go right. You have the choice to follow formulas, to believe the managers and the A&R men, and to respond to criticism by trying to come up with something that they will like better next time, where you try and get more radio play, higher sales, better chart positions all the time by sort of second guessing the audience. The other route that you can go is being true to yourself, is really, you know, writing and singing from the heart. And you have to be willing, if you're going to do that, to accept that if it doesn't work, if people don't get it, then they've rejected you. You know, you put yourself out there, you sang from the heart, and they just rejected it. So it's playing for higher stakes, basically. But I think as you read the book, you'll see that I'm constantly faced with these sort of dilemmas, and you'll see the way that I came out at the end of the day, which is that I sort of chose, you know, what I would like to consider, you know, the truth over the filthy lucre. So the second half of the book is more about the tech world, and I made a deliberate decision around about 1990. I was getting sort of disillusioned really with the music business, and Silicon Valley beckoned because the beginnings of the internet were beginning to sort of rear their heads, and there was a huge excitement around that, whereas the music industry was sort of starting to show its cracks. And for a few years I'd been using software and hardware that had been written by geeks in Silicon Valley. You know, I'd gone from using dedicated machines like the Fairlight that only a handful of people had, to using mass market machines like the Mac and software that cost a few $100s, which basically made my technology accessible to tens of thousands of other musicians. So computer music and electronic music were really going mainstream by 1990. But the thing that fascinated me was that the software I was using, as soon as I got my hands on it, I would see alternative ways to use it that nobody had apparently thought of yet. And it's always been, you know, I've always had this sort of irresistible compulsion to dig into the nooks and crannies of some new technology and find ways to use it that have not been explored yet. So what would happen with this software is that I'd get a hold of it and I'd think of some new technique that wasn't described in the user manual. And I'd try it out, and very often I would take the results back to the manufacturer, back to the software company, and say, hey, I bet you never thought of using your software like this. So this is companies like Opcode, who made Vision, and DigiDesign, who made Pro Tools, and so on. And I was living in Los Angeles, but I was going back and forth all the time, consulting with these companies, and they would ask my advice about where to go with the next rev of their software. And if I was lucky, if I suggested a feature to them, 6 months later I would get a new revision of the software and my feature would actually be incorporated into the software. So I was hooked at this point. You know, I was never a computer programmer myself, but I'd spent enough time with them that I'd really caught the bug. And so in about 1991 I moved from LA to Silicon Valley and I started messing around with software. And it was beginning to be a period when the investment into Silicon Valley, into the beginnings of the internet and the web, was coming from all sides. So if you had a good idea in Silicon Valley and you could sit yourself down with an investor, a venture capitalist, and if it was an idea you could just scrawl on the back of a paper napkin, you could get somebody to pull out their checkbook and fund it for you. So basically I formed this company, Headspace, and we set about trying to make really cool interactive music applications for the internet. And the internet was pretty much silent at the time. There was very primitive streaming audio, like real audio. But I thought, okay, the beauty of the web is that you're not streaming graphics and texts. You have hypertext, so it's very quick to load in a browser. You have like a chunk of text with a description of the size of the font and over here you have a graphic that is just a link to a graphic on a server somewhere, and it's, you know, a web page was compiled in real time. And that's basically the way music is, you know, electronic music is done. You've got MIDI, which is just a description language, triggering samples or notes. So we created something called the music markup language. And I was able to take this to people like Jim Clark, who started Netscape, and pitch it to him and get him to take seriously the idea that music had a home on the web as well. And it was an uphill battle for the most part at the beginning, because they were looking for a business model for the web other than just giving everything away for free. And their focus at the time was on what they called the enterprise. So this would be businesses, this would be business to business, commerce, you know, big servers, companies like Amazon and eBay, and airlines going online and so on. It wasn't about consumer media stuff at all. And in fact, the only company that really took consumer multimedia seriously was Apple. And the investors thought that Apple were a bunch of hippie dreamers. In fact, when they came to my offices at Beatnik and they saw Macs on the desktop, one of them took me aside and said, you know, Thomas, you really need to get the Apples out of here, because we see that, we think, well, this guy is just a dreamer. We don't take it seriously. So fast forward 20 years, you know, who's the biggest company in the world? And what was their killer app? Well, it was music, and it was Apple. So they were wrong about that one. But I can't pretend that my vision for music on the internet was the same as everybody else's. What I wanted to do with it was make really cool sort of explorable 3D worlds that you could wander around at will, triggering interactive music and jamming with your friends. I wanted it all to be sort of beautiful and visceral and so on. I wanted people, instead of mixing music in recording studios with knobs and sliders, I wanted them making fantastic gestures in the air to mix music and so on. So it's not as if my vision for music was something that was really bankable. So I had this company in Silicon Valley for about 10 years, and we had fabulous press releases and launch parties, and we had booths at Las Vegas at the Consumer Electronics Show, and we had mouse pads and satin tour jackets and so on. And we had revenues of $0 billion per year, like most dot-com companies. And like most dot-com companies, we would have gone pop along with the bubble when it burst at the end of the 1990s, were it not for a single deal that we had. And that was with Nokia. Now, our technology that we created was a software synthesizer, not a synthesizer with keys and knobs. That would be a hardware synthesizer, but a chunk of code that basically synthesized sound in real time. And in the professional music world, people were starting to use software synthesizers on computers, but they were designed to be used on high-end computers. So they would use the maximum processing power that computers had at the time. Our software synthesizer was designed to work as efficiently as possible, because we wanted people to download it when they hit a web page. So we did a sonified version of Yahoo, and Yahoo's only complaint about it was it would slow down the time it took to load the front page. So we said, how long does it take? Well, it's adding about 20 seconds to the load time. This is on modems. And we said, well, if we could get it down to 5 seconds, would that be acceptable? You know, and so they said, well, do it and bring it back to us, and we'll try it out. So my engineers were basically sitting around trying to figure out how efficient they could make a software synthesizer. So whereas other companies like Propeller Heads and so on were making high-end software synthesizers that were being used by pro musicians to make electronic music, Beatnik made the smallest and most efficient software synthesizer ever invented. So Nokia had seen in about 1997, they were already the top mobile phone company in the world, but they were threatened by Asian, specifically Japanese mobile phone companies, Panasonic and LG and people like that. And some of those phones were coming out with a Yamaha MIDI chip in them that could play musical melodies for ringtones. And at the time, Nokia's phones just beeped. So they thought, well, to keep up with this, we ought to put a synthesizer in our phones. But they didn't want to go buy a chip from Yamaha or Roland or someone like that for $1, $2 a unit. Partly because of the cost, if you're selling hundreds of millions of dollars, millions of phones, but partly also because if the Yamaha factory, in Seoul, Korea, is hit by a tsunami, then it would wipe out a whole quarter's worth of Nokia phone sales. So they couldn't afford the liability of having a third-party component in their phones from somebody like Yamaha. So they looked for a software solution that could be embedded in the code in their own processors. And they looked at stuff like propeller heads, but it was too unwieldy to work on their puny processors in their phones. So they looked around and they found Beatnik, which they thought might be efficient enough. So they asked us if we could send an engineer over to Helsinki, Finland, to try and get our synthesizer working in their phones to make ringtones. And so there's another passage from the book that I wanted to read you. And this really, I think, refers back to the fact that many people think that brilliant software is sort of created by a couple of guys in the garage when they have this genius flash and a light bulb pops and Steve come up with a Mac or whatever it is. In my experience, it's a lot more random than that. And in fact, the very first ringtones that ever happened came about because a marketing guy overheard an engineer tuning the ringer to find the most annoying frequency, so you could hear it in your handbag or in your pocket. And the marketing guy said, "Oh, you got it playing music now." And the engineer goes, "Nope, I'm just trying to make it as annoying as possible." And the marketing guy said, "Well, look, could you make it play some tunes?" And the engineer goes, "Okay." And so he programs in some tunes and brings it into a marketing meeting. It's all true. Brings it into a marketing meeting, and all the marketing department love that it's got pop tunes on it now. And the lawyer goes, No, you can't just ship a pop song on your phone. I mean, one of these is by Madonna, for God's sake. There's publishers, there's songwriters, there's record companies. The marketing guy goes, "Well, what about if it was composed by a dead guy?" And the engineer goes, "Oh, one of these actually was 150 years old. It came from a guitar concerto written in the middle of the last century." And it goes, dee 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 dee. The marketing guy goes, "Let's ship it." So that was the dawn of the Nokia waltz, as it was called. But we sort of came into this picture, and they decided that they wanted polyphonic ringtones on all of their phones, and they couldn't do that with just these little beeps. So they needed a synthesizer to do it. So I hopped on a plane over to Helsinki, and it's kind of an interesting experience. My first encounter with Finnish culture. Oh, I've just lost the page. Okay. So it was fascinating to be here in Nokia's inner sanctum. The Finnish business culture was very strange to me. They're not a talkative bunch. They sit in meetings for long periods and nobody says anything. You ask a simple yes or no question and it falls into a cone of silence. You can almost hear the wind whistling across the tundra. Then, quietly, one of them replies, "Maybe." It is said that in Finland the difference between an extrovert and an introvert is that an extrovert Finn looks at your toes when he's talking to you. In daylight, the corporate culture is sombre. The more important the meeting, the longer the awkward silence is. Yet when 5 p.m. comes around, they hit the saunas, and shortly thereafter, the drinking begins in earnest. Wild vodka quaffing sessions and hatchet-throwing games go long into the night. Then, early the next morning, there they are back in their meeting rooms, hungover, deep in contemplation. After the second day of meetings, a dozen Nokians took me out to a restaurant to sample the local delicacies. The menu was saipua kala, soapfish, and reindeer carpaccio. They all spoke perfect English, the company's international business language of choice. At one point, they reverted to their native tongue as a senior VP, Pekka Poilikalio, told a joke in Finnish, and everybody dissolved in fits of laughter. I asked Pekka to share the joke with me. There were a few titters. "Well, I don't think this joke translates well into English," said Pekka, "but I will try if you like." 10 Swedes go into a cupboard to play hunting games. They turn out the lights and each one throws his knife. The first one to squeal is called Sven. More torrential laughter erupted round the table. Evidently the joke was just as funny in English as it was in Finnish. The most senior and by far the most gregarious Nokian I met was Anssi Vanjoki, EVP of Digital Convergence. He looked suave in a pinstripe suit, but on weekends he rode a big motorbike around town, sporting a red bandana. In fact, he later earned the Guinness World Record for the highest ever speeding fine. He had to cough up more than 119,000 euros after being clocked on his Harley Davidson, going 20 miles per hour over the limit on the streets of Helsinki. Speeding fines in Finland are proportional to the offender's income. Over a working lunch, Anssi told me how the idea for ringtones came about, and that was the story about the engineer and the Nokia waltz. So the long and the short of it was that they licensed the Beatnik synth and put it in the phone. And they told me they were going to ship 90 million units in the first quarter. And the interesting thing was that in California, nobody really got what ringtones were all about. In fact, the record companies were incredibly upset that people seemed to be willing to pay $2.50 for a ringtone, a sort of beepy rendition of a tune, but they weren't willing to spend 99 cents on the actual song as a download. But I realized one day why this was, and they were barking up completely the wrong tree. It was Christmas, and I was shopping with my kids in a mall, in a shopping mall outside San Francisco, and I sat down on a bench. I was a bit overloaded, and I was watching this group of teenagers across the mall from me, standing outside like a sports shop, and a phone went off, and it was the riff from an Eminem song that was in the charts at the time. And the teenager whipped it out and answered it and so on. And I thought, okay, Eminem is a rapper, and this kid is willing to spend $2.50 to get just the synth line from the Eminem song. But the record companies are saying that he won't pay $1 for the entire song. But then I looked at these kids and I realized, they had sneakers with, the plus sign for Nike or the M sign for New Balance. They could get the same pair of sneakers 20 or 30 bucks cheaper without the logo, but it was worth their while to have the logo because it was like, that's who I am. That, it's a statement about myself when I go out with my friends in the shopping mall. So I realized that the ringtone, when that went off, it wasn't their music budget that it was coming from. It was their fashion budget, it was their clothes budget, and that's why they were willing to spend money on it. So, when they started shipping these phones with the Beatnik synth inside, I had very mixed feelings about it because I'd be out and about, I'd be on a bus, on a tram, in an airport lounge, I'd hear a phone go off with whatever the ringtone du jour was, and I knew it was playing through my synthesizer. But it was a slightly bittersweet feeling because I thought, okay, I was supposed to be the guy that brought warmth and humanity to synthesizers, and I've accidentally created the most popular synthesizer of all time. There's hundreds of millions of these out there, and those beeps are the sum total of what I've created here. So, when that thought really hit me, it was sort of time to back off from business and technology and sort of get back to music, which was my first love. So I moved back to the UK after that, retired from Beatnik. And I spent a few years in my Lifeboat studio in East Anglia, sort of getting reacquainted with music again. Not just music, but also film. I made a documentary film that I took out in the road called The Invisible Lighthouse, projected it behind me and played the music score and narrated it and so on. Put out an album, A Map of the Floating City. But as I was sitting there writing songs for an album, I thought to myself, in the 15 years I've been away, they're not really buying albums anymore. What the heck am I thinking? What they were doing was spending time on social media and playing video games and so on. So I thought, well, there's no reason why I shouldn't create a different kind of platform for my music. So I came up with an idea for a game called the Floating City game, and it was free, worked in a browser, and it incorporated all of the concepts and characters and objects from my entire catalogue of songs. And the idea of it was you had to collaborate with other players, and you had to be both good at video games and know a bit about Dolby songs. So it actually meant that sort of young and old players worked together in these tribes. And there were several thousand players, simultaneously doing the game. And if you progressed in the game, you would actually win the right to download the songs from the new album. So that was really my most sort of recent creative endeavour. And that project with the film caught the attention of a university in the USA, Johns Hopkins University. And they were looking for somebody to help them launch a film and media centre. And they thought that I would be a great candidate for that. So I found myself 3 years ago heading to Baltimore, USA, to a new position as Professor of the Arts at Johns Hopkins University. And it occurred to me that my dad would be tickled pink to think that the one black sheep in his very academic family, because I left school at 16 to work in a fruit and veg shop, that finally after 40-something years later, I'd finally joined the family firm, and I now can put prof in front of my name. Although most pull-down menus don't have prof, which is very annoying. Very hard to get a good table in a restaurant. So that's currently what I'm doing, and the good thing about that gig is that I get to spend 8 months of the year in Baltimore, which is a very, very cool city with these brilliant students coming up with these wild projects. And between May and August every year, I get to come back to East Anglia and hang out with my family and take it easy. And it gives me a window of opportunity to do other projects. So during that time, the last 2 of those, I've written this book. I'm working on a new project now, which somewhere down the line is probably going to see the light of day. I'm not done making music, you may be glad to hear, nor am I done writing, because I've absolutely loved writing this book. And there's always something new around the corner, there's always some new way of expressing myself. And I'm just incredibly grateful, really, that I still have any kind of an audience for that. And I think as I get older and get more sensible, I think more of the truth is going to come out in the stuff that I do. So thanks again for coming out. It's been a great evening. So now is the time for those questions that you've always been dying to ask me.
I've got one.
Yeah.
You might be able to correct me, but I think the first time I ever saw you was on television on something called the David Essex Showcase. Do you remember that?
I do remember that.
Yeah. And I remember you, for me, you blew everybody else away on the show. I thought, he's got to win this.
Except David.
And you didn't win. You didn't win. It was like terrible.
What, was it a contest?
It was a contest, and the one who won it got a contract or something. I can't remember what year it was, whether it was early 80s or late 70s.
And what was the song?
Wind Power.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah. On your own with some Apple Macs.
Okay.
Stage, yeah.
It can't have been Apple Macs.
No, actually, they wouldn't have been. I think they were Commodore PETs.
It was probably that was more likely, or a Spectrum, something like that, or maybe my PPG 340 380 wave computer, which was the size of a refrigerator, called Henry, and it was the size of a refrigerator and designed to turn Tangerine Dream's light show on and off. It had 2 little micro cassette like holders on the front of it, and when I did a few concerts with it, as the backing, and so I had a rack of these micro cassettes in pairs. So I'd pull out Wind Power A and Wind Power B, and slot them in, and then type on the keyboard load return, and then it would start this green screen. The cursor would start going down. It took 52 seconds to load. But there was about a 50-50 chance that after that, if you type run return, it would actually run. And if it didn't run, you'd have to go through the process again. So any chops I have at public speaking date back to those days when I had to come up with spur-of-the-moment anecdotes in chunks of 52 seconds.
Do you have a big collection of old classic keyboards that you highlight?
It's funny you should mention that. A lot of people... Actually, there's 2 things to say about the book. One is, why aren't you a multi-millionaire? The other is, why isn't there more about analog synthesizers in there? I'm actually, I'm not one of those hoarders of old technology. I went through all of that. I had everything under the sun, and I had my favourites. and my less favourites. A lot of them I actually lost when I had a storage unit at John Henry's up the road here, and it was broken into, and a bunch of stuff was stolen in the late 80s, something like that. And I never actually replaced it. Well, it was partly because it had just, a lot of those synths, like sort of Jupiter 8s and things, I think when it came out it cost about $2.5 grand. And probably 4 years later it would have been worth about 500. And then another 4 years after that it was worth about £4,000. And the point where my stuff was broken into was sort of at the peak of value, you know, for all of that stuff. So it's slightly heartbreaking to have to pay over the odds to replace all that stuff. But it was more of a philosophical thing, really. I have a weird thing where I sort of like to burn my bridges in a way. If I lost that Jupiter 8, it sort of forces me to go out and find something new, some new toy to play with. And these days, of course, you know, for a few quid, you can get a Jupiter 8 plug-in, you know, for Logic or Ableton or whatever it is. And you know what? They don't sound quite as good, but compared to the hassle of, you know, carting that thing around and it would go out of tune, and I mean, my songs in the old days, you know, I'd have everything wired up and everything would be perfect, and I'd work till 4 in the morning till I dropped, and then I'd say, I've got to get some sleep, and I'd get a few hours sleep and come back, and you know, the cleaning lady had been in and tripped over a wire and it was all gone, you know, and so there was a sense of impermanence about everything in those days. These days, of course, you know, your hard drive might crash or something, but basically speaking, if you leave it at 4 o'clock in the morning, hit save, close your laptop, and then spend the next week writing your new book, and then reopen the file, it's going to come back sounding exactly the way it did when you left it. And I like that, you know, I like the convenience of that. I don't like the uncertainty of 4 o'clock this morning, it sounded better than this, you know, what happened?
Could always get yourself a JP08.
JP08.
Seen those little boutique things that we're all doing now?
Yeah, yeah. I've got a few. I've got a lovely Moog Voyager that they gave me a few years ago as a sort of lifetime achievement award, and it's got patch chords and things, and that's kind of great. But most of my old kit, I haven't got anymore. Yeah.
How do you think the music industry is using the internet today, and is there anything you would think would be a better way for the music industry to be using the internet?
Well, it's thrilling, you know, what's going on. It's not all good, but you can't slow down, you know, you can't turn back the hands of time. Obviously, the good side is that all of this stuff is way more accessible than it ever was when I started out. I mean, I was so lucky that I got to be one of the pioneers, if you like. Partly because there are only half a dozen of us, you know, that had sequencers, that had drum machines or samplers in the early days. So anything you did was bound to be unique and original and innovative, because nobody had tried anything, you know. Nowadays, anybody can try that stuff. Anybody with the motivation can get a hold of that stuff and have a crack at it. And the result they can put up online, you know, on SoundCloud, on YouTube, you know, they can publicize it themselves. So it's a much more level playing field. It's sort of meritocracy now. And I think that's good, because I think when you're 16, 17 and you've got talent, and you've got this burning urge to get it out there, you want to believe that all that has to happen is the world's going to hear my music and fall in love with it, and I'll be a superstar. And it's really important not to discourage, you know, not to throw any, not to put the dampers on that. But I think, you know, when I started out, the simple fact was it didn't matter how brilliant your stuff was. The world was never going to fall in love with it unless you were able to get a tape to an A&R man and get signed and get in the studio and get in the radio and get in the shops, you know, and that filtered out, you know, a huge percentile. And I had friends and contemporaries that were brilliantly talented and they never pursued it beyond their mid-20s because they just didn't make it through that obstacle course. So now anybody can do it, but that's also the downside, is that anybody can do it. So now you do great stuff, and there's 20,000 other people who had the same exact idea at the same exact moment, you know. And so that's what you have to struggle with now. But I still think, given the choice of one or the other, you know, I think this is an exciting time to be doing it. But it's different, you know. I mean, it's just a different age, really. It's not as exciting for me because I like to be in sort of rarefied air, you know. For example, you know, writing this book, I didn't feel like I was one of 20,000 people all writing a music memoir at the same time. I'd rather be competing with, you know, Springsteen and Brian Wilson and Robbie Robertson. You know, at least there's only half a dozen of them. And it was exciting for me, you know, to be trying to express myself in a new medium. So the next project I get onto, whatever that is going to be something again where I feel that it's a special thing because there's not many people working in that field.
Did you have any?
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry if you covered this at the beginning, because I missed the first 5 minutes. But could you kind of talk us through your recollections of working with Bowie at Live Aid, how that kind of came about?
Yeah. Well, apologies to anybody that's read the book or heard me tell this story, but I mean, it's all very fleeting. You know, firstly, I have to say that I was part of a generation who absolutely adored Bowie. Even before he started doing electronic music, you know, I mean, I just followed him from very early on. And when I was at school, if he put out a new album, you know, we'd be in line to get it. We'd pore over the lyrics and we'd play it back to back, you know, for weeks. And among my friends, we would analyse the lyrics and we'd figure out the chords on guitar or keyboard or whatever. And every new fashion statement he came out with, or every interview he did, was an absolute thrill. And then he teamed up with Brian Eno and went to Berlin and did Low and was making pop records entirely with synthesizers, and just an absolute thrill start to finish. So, you know, I was really gobsmacked, you know, as were the rest of the band when we got the invitation to work with him. And the way it came about was this. So he did Absolute Beginners and then Dancing in the Streets with Mick Jagger. And the guitarist and bass player on both of those were Kevin Armstrong and Matthew Seligman, who had been cohorts of mine for a long time, played on some of my albums. So then Live Aid came about, and it was really on a short fuse, you know, there weren't months of preparation. And artists like Bowie were approached to appear, and he got maybe 2-3 weeks notice of this gig. And his regular touring band, which included people like Earl Slick and so on, were off doing other tours in the States. He was here filming Labyrinth at Pinewood with George Lucas. And so he's already in the country, and he gets invited to do this charity gig. And his regular band couldn't do it, so he thought, well, I'll ask Matthew and Kevin, who I'd played with, to help me put the rest of the band together. And they said, well, you should talk to Thomas. He's a producer and he's, you know, works with a lot of musicians, and we'll figure out who the rest of the band should be. So we went to Neil Conti from Prefab Sprout on drums, and Claire Hurst on sax, and Tessa Niles and somebody else and backing singers. Put this band together, and we had 3 rehearsals with Bowie at Nomis Studios in Olympia. We were there all afternoon, and Bowie came in for 2 or 3 hours in the evening, 3 nights in a row. And he was exhausted because he'd been up since, you know, 4 or 5 a.m. getting his hairs done, you know, for Labyrinth. And so he was fairly exhausted by the time he came to us. But he would walk in, and he said, well, he would have given us a list beforehand of songs to work out. And we all knew the songs anyway. I mean, we'd grown up with the songs, so we knew them, but we'd worked them out before he came in. I was sort of MDing it. And he'd come in and he'd say, well, let's have a go at Modern Love. And we'd start playing it. And now he can play most of those instruments, right? But he never came over to my keyboard and said, no, it should be more like this. He sort of stood in the middle of the room exuding wonderfulness, you know, and he was just a complete gent from start to finish. And that was a bit of a surprise to me, because I was sort of expecting, you know, the cracked actor, you know, the thin white dude, the sort of strung out Berlin, you know, junkie. And in fact, he was this perfect English gentleman. So the first time he ever called me, you know, I was on a coin box in a studio in West London. And he was like, oh, Thomas, would you be so kind as to play with me at Wembley? Sort of like that. So it was very much a surprise. So we had these rehearsals, and he kept changing his mind about what to do. Because he'd originally said, well, it's going to be televised, I'm going to do my current single, which was Loving the Alien. So he went into it thinking it's like a high-profile opportunity to plug my current single, you know. And as he got more focused, and you know the world got more focused on the Wembley show, he realised it wasn't about plugging his then single. It was about anthems, you know. It was about getting the crowd going and so on. So he kept giving us a different list every day of songs to work out. And the 4 songs we ended up doing, we did play through each of them on the last night's rehearsal, which is it was on the Friday evening before the Saturday of the gig. But we never played them back to back. You know, we play one, fix it, go on to the next one, fix that. We never played them straight through, and we didn't know what order he was going to do them in. So the first time we'd ever played them as a set was on stage at Live Aid, and the morning of the show was fantastic. You remember it was this kind of weather. I mean, bright. You know, blue skies, warm. You would walk around. I went for a walk by the river, you know, 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, and you could hear the TV preambles of the show coming out of an upstairs window. And if you stopped at a traffic light, you know, a car with its window wound down would be playing the radio commentary about the show. And they knew the traffic was going to be really bad going to Wembley, so they instructed me to go to Battersea heliport. I lived in Fulham. I went to Battersea heliport, and I was due to take the helicopter to Wembley with Bowie. I get to Battersea heliport, and there was a gaggle of fans, and he was already in his blue suit, and he was like signing autographs and things, looking really friendly. And in the background was this helicopter with the rotors going around and the door open. And he turned around, he just got this sort of sick look on his face, because Bowie hated flying. And he'd never flown at all until a couple of years before that. He used to take the Queen Elizabeth, you know, used to take an ocean liner when he went to New York. And he'd only recently overcome his fear of flying enough to get in a plane, but he'd never been in a helicopter. So he waved to the fans, and he and I got in the helicopter, and he was wearing this Homburg hat, and he was just absolutely quaking, and he pulled the hat down over his face and started chain smoking Camels. And they closed the door, and the pilot turned around and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Bowie, you can't smoke in the plane." And he just kept doing it, you know. "How long is this flight?" And the pilot said, "Well, it's 11 minutes, Mr. Bowie, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to extinguish the cigarette." And he was getting down to the end. He used it to light the next one, completely ignored the pilot. He said, "Are there any high buildings in the way? What about electric pylons?" I mean, he's just sort of completely uptight. I mean, he turned into, you know, the cracked actor. Like the scene in that documentary when he's in the back of a limo and he's got the carton of orange juice or milk, whatever. It's just unlike the fly in the carton of orange. That was the character. And it lasted 11 minutes. And at the climax of it, I have this memory of, we banked over Wembley Stadium, the Twin Towers and everything, and there he is with his Homburg chain smoking. And Jumbotrons had just come in, big video screens. So in the foreground I had Bowie's profile, in the background I had Freddie Mercury on the screen crooning up to the heavens in the middle of, you know, "We Are the Champions" or something. And we banked over the stadium and we landed, you know, in the car park, you know, some back area of Wembley Stadium. As soon as we landed, he relaxed. And there were paparazzi, there was like 100 paparazzi with cameras. And he looked at me and said, "Oh, I love this bit." And he opened the door and he went out. Flashbulbs start popping, and, you know, he was back to the way he had been before. And we were taken straight from there to the side of the stage. There wasn't time to go to the dressing room or anything like that. As we got to the wings, sort of peeked out, saw the crowd, and Geldof, or whoever it was on stage doing the intro, and he jabbed me in the ribs and he said, "Let's start with TBC 15. The plan had been to start with Modern Love." And I'm thinking, oh, it's only a honky-tonk piano solo, you know, which is not exactly my genre. So I just went out there and the drummer tapped it in, and there I was. And it felt like it was going really well. You know, I'm staring at Bowie's back in his blue suit, and it just, people were rocking out, and it felt good. But I was really worried about Heroes, which I think we played twice in rehearsal. And Heroes on the surface is a pretty simple song, you know, it doesn't have elaborate chord sequences like Life on Mars or something like that. But actually, the simple songs are often the easiest ones to screw up, because you forget whether a section is 8 bars long or 12 bars long. It's like, do we go to the B section here? I can't. Oh, it's very easy to screw up. Actually, it'd be easier to remember where you are in Life on Mars than it would be in Heroes. So, and I'm playing this synth line, but then I've got to go do 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 do. I'm convinced I'm going to come in with that at the wrong moment. Either one or the other. I'm either play that at the wrong time, or keep playing the other riff. But in the moment, I'm playing Heroes on stage. Like a few feet behind David Bowie. There's 100,000 people out there. And this is like the anthem of my teenage years. And I never stopped to think about A sections, B sections. My fingers just played themselves. It was fantastic. And then the only other thing I'd mention about that is that we came off stage, and it's a bit blurry because we went and immediately hit the cooler in the dressing room. And then Bowie said, well, I'm going up front to watch whoever it was that was coming on afterwards. So I went up and sat in the royal box behind Charles and Diana, and Bowie said that, well, they want us back on stage at the end to do We Are the World or whatever it was. It wasn't me, it was him and the performance. And he leaned forward and he said to Princess Diana, so, Your Majesty, we're going to see you up on stage for the finale. And she said, I might be able to manage the national anthem. Oh, and there's always another footnote, isn't there? YouTube has this way of sort of bringing back memories that are long suppressed. And somebody told me a while ago, there's a clip on YouTube of you and Bowie doing an interview backstage at Live Aid. I thought, oh God, and I went there and I looked, I'd forgotten all about this, that there was a TV interview. And there's this clip, and there's the two of us sitting in the dressing room, and Bowie is completely composed. I mean, he's joking around, but he's perfectly composed. And I'm sitting there with like a Woodbine and a can of beer, and I've got this look on my face that says, it's David fucking Bowie. And I made some smart-ass crack or whatever, and I'm a complete fool of myself. And then Bowie, sort of went along with the joke, and then he turned to the camera and he said, there are millions of starving children. And he did this perfect little sort of editorial about the day and so on. And I wish they would erase that from the
So we're all going to go and watch that.
Yeah.
I've seen it.
Yes, yeah.
I've seen it.
You had a question about it?
Yeah. Do you have an approach to songwriting, or do you have, or do you get like a new bit of technology and you think, oh, that's interesting, and build something from that, or do you have like a formal process?
Yeah, there's not a single process. It's not words first, music first, or anything like that. I do most of my writing at the piano, actually. I have an old electric piano at home which has actual strings, so the good thing is you don't even need to plug it in. It feels like a piano, it's a Yamaha electric brand. And I don't amplify it, I just play. I'm usually just leaned over it, playing very quietly. I don't want to annoy anybody else in the house. And that's often the way that I write. But the songs are usually a concept first and foremost. So there'll be a title, there might be a first line, like an opening line, couple of other lines that I sort of fill in, stream of consciousness, and I'll come up with a line of lyrics. I go, that really feels like a first line of the second verse. So I write that down and I go, well, that means the third line's got to rhyme with it. So I figure out the third line, and that means I can fill in the second and the fourth line. So there's a part of it that's just like a crossword puzzle. And part of it, if I've got a good verse, good music for the verse, and I need a chorus, I quite often take the verse melody and sort of turn it on its head or turn the phrasing around. I mean, very often, if sections of a song are complementary, they're sort of an inverted version of each other in a lot of cases. So there is, I wouldn't call it a formula, but there is a craft to it which you sort of learn and develop for yourself as time goes on. But no, there's no single method. a lot of songs I'll be in the shower, I'll be driving out for a walk, you know, on the marshes or whatever, and the idea sort of comes to me, and very often they're fully formed by the time I ever figure out the notes. When people come to my lifeboat, which has got these amazing sort of 360-degree views of the sea and the marshes behind, and there's this big container port nearby, and these fantastic container ships going in and out. I've got a periscope, and I sort of play, you know, submarine games and things. And my friends come and visit me in the lifeboat, and they go, "I don't know how you get any work done. I would just be staring out over the sea all day." And I go, "Well, that's me working. You know, I can come and sit here for 3 hours staring out at the sea, and it's going on in my mind. And by the time I actually open a new file on the computer and start figuring out the notes, I can already hear a lot of the arrangement in my head." Right, one last question. Two last questions.
Okay. She blinded me with science. It was obviously Magnus Pike was in there. Was that your idea to get him in the video, or was that something that somebody else come up with? And was he a sort of a child who is kind of iconic, sort of slight hero of yours?
So yeah, the way that came about. So I put out my first couple of releases. I'd say as far as the first ever version of the Golden Age of Wireless, which She Blinded Me with Science was not on, and people picked up on the sort of the boffin image, which was partly deliberate, but not something I really cultivated. You know, I just always liked old gear and equipment, and I had this studious look about me, very different from the sort of pop stars of the era, from the Adamants and Stings and people. And a magazine in Japan voted me Young Scientist of the Year, 1981. And I was joking about this with my then girlfriend, and saying that's probably the only #1 I'll ever have, you know, is Young Scientist of the Year, 1981. And I said, but actually, you know, this image seems to be really taking hold, and maybe I should push that a little bit. And she said, well, I wouldn't go too far with it, because, you know, I don't think people fall in love with the sort of boffin character, you know. And at the time, I'd written She Blinded Me with Science, and I had the storyboard for it that I was working on, and I was just getting ready to do the video. And it occurred to me that if I had a bona fide scientist present in the song and in the video, then it would make me look more like a pop star, you know. So I thought of Magnus Pike, and I found to my amazement that in Central Casting catalogue, there was Dr. Magnus Pike with his agent, and he was hireable by the hour or by the day. So I got him in the studio with me. I had this little studio in West London, in front of a microphone. I'd written down these phrases for him to blurt out. And he wasn't very cooperative, you know, to be perfectly honest. So like the first one on there, he said, you know, what is it again? And I said, She blinded me with science. And he sort of went, okay, are we rolling? She blinded me with science. I said, Dr. Pike, it's not really a question. It's more of a statement. You know. He said, yes, but as a known scientist, it's surprising if the girl blinded me with science. And that's sort of the way he was, you know, he had his brand, you know, to contend with. And in fact, when we shot the video, he was, like, I had him in a white coat on the storyboard. He refused to wear a white coat, wouldn't wear a white coat, absolutely not. That's not the way that my public sees me at all. And you may have heard the story before, but the last time I ever saw him, when he was still alive, he just got back from a lecture tour of the USA, and I said, you know, did it go well? And he said, no, frankly, it was terrible, Dolby. I said, why is that? He said, every time I walk down the street, someone will come up behind me on the sidewalk and go, science! It scared me out of my bloody skin. So because it would appear that your bloody MTV video is better known over there than my body of scientific work. You know, I have a lot to be thankful for.
I just wonder, in terms of the accessibility of music software, have you played with Sonic Pi at all?
Sonic Pi? No, but I shall.
Ah, right.
What is Sonic Pi?
It's phenomenal. Well, it's been developed by a guy in Cambridge to teach kids to program, but using music.
Oh, right.
And it's actually sort of overtaken the musical aspects, have almost overtaken the programming aspects. And this guy, being a computer scientist, now DJs all around the world with his software.
Okay,
Yeah,
Sonic
Sonic
Pi.
Pi.
Thanks for the
Look it
tip.
up.
All right, well, listen, thanks again for coming out. You've been a really nice audience. Thank you so much. And, if you have a copy of the book or anything else you want signed, I'm going to go behind the counter and see you there.